Hello, I'm Jake Boudrot, Civic Journalist at Tello Community Television. In this episode of Strait Talk, wildlife biologist Bob Bancroft delivered a presentation about his experiences with biodiversity, climate change, and wildlife protection, which took place on September 27th at Vipi Lodge in Janvrins Island. After the talk, Bancroft answered my questions. So your presentation was entitled Forests, Fire, and Wildlife. Maybe first we can start by talking. There might be some people who are familiar with you through CBC Radio and others, but maybe some people who aren't as familiar. So if you won't mind, maybe talking a little bit about yourself, your experience and skills in education and stuff like that.
Well, I started off and got a couple of degrees at university in biology, and worked in a number of with trees in Maritime Forest Research Center, and then Agriculture Canada and whatnot. And then I became a regional biologist. And after that, I became an extension biologist, which is talking education. And then I became a fisheries biologist. And then I quit early in life and just have been working myself as a consulting biologist. I'm also involved with Nature Nova Scotia for 16 years, 28 groups trying to raise a louder voice for nature considerations.
You mentioned some groups that you've been involved with, some environmental groups, and that maybe you want to talk about some of your involvement currently and kind of in the past with some of these groups and who they are.
Federation of Anglers and Hunters, a couple of other fishing organizations that I don't need to name really, and Canadian Wildlife Federation. I was on the executive nationally. And but for the last 16 years, I've been with Nature Nova Scotia, which is an affiliate of Nature Canada. So, and we don't get money from government at all to speak of. Because we want to speak the reality to government, so we depend on private funding. The first picture I have here is from a property in New Brunswick that we're lucky enough to buy. The property we have in Pomkit is old farmland. This one, somebody forgot to cut it. And the point I wanted to make here was that forests that have not been harvested are very different. And this is only one kind. But if you look, some of the interesting things about this picture is that a lot of the trees are 30 meters apart. And the canopy from the limbs extends about 15 meters. And if you look at the shade on a sunny day, the solar panels are the leaves. And the soil is usually moist, even well, I wouldn't say everything is moist this year, but in a normal year, and the temperature is much lower as you've ever traveled into a shady forest in the summertime. So really, I'm not going to go into all the different forms, but it's a treat when you get to old growth forest that's been handled gently or not at all by humans. The forest I wanted to talk about because we're hearing all about fire out in west. And fires out west are a different thing altogether in terms of how they originated. So the New England hardwoods are to the south in this picture. I don't think you can see, we know where we are. And although they've changed from cutting, they're still basically New England hardwoods. And to the north, and there's little spots here, the area that's covered with green and slanted is either called the Acadian forest or the Wabanaki forest of late. And it extends down to New Hampshire and Massachusetts. But the boreal is a different kind of forest altogether out west and up north. Whereas, and to the south, it's New England. And this is an area where there's a mix of hardwoods and softwoods. And that's different, which is why it's been differentiated. Interestingly, the Mi'kmaq actually categorized this forest in roughly the same area. They knew that it was different from the others, and of course, tribes that interacted with each other and whatnot. So, I want to explain a little bit about how forests form after they've been cleared, and the open ground is on the left-hand side here. And this is a growth. The bottom are the years, and the top is the volumes. The amount that per square, whatever you want to call it, will grow. And this is from the St. John River, but it's pretty well true everywhere. So if you start off on bare ground, if you follow up here, it gradually goes in, and I call this nature's healing process because there's a lot of trees that can take bare open ground with the sunlight hitting right down, and they can grow in really tough conditions with like that on say open fields, or a clear cut. And you know them all because that's what we're surrounded with when you drive around. Is poplar and fir and spruce and wire birch and a bunch of other things that come in after a fire or after land clearing. If you look at the volume here, it starts off with basically bare ground that's just very low, and then it comes up, and you see that after about 55 or 60 years, the volume of fiber that you've got on a given acre, let's say an acre, it is up to a certain level. And it is per acre here on the side, actually cords per acre. And then what happens is if there's a seed source nearby, you wind up with, I call these sun-loving, they call them shade intolerant, but I think it's just the sun-loving trees move in first. Then if there's a seed source nearby, the shade tolerant ones, the ones that the young one can grow under trees that are providing shade. They're the yellow birch, the sugar maple, the hemlocks. There's a whole series of other trees that tend to live for hundreds of years. So they come in and they start off in the graph here, and they come up. And I'm not going to get into too much detail here, but if you had a forest and you wanted to maximize the volume, you'd probably go to the 60 year or 65 year point on the pioneer species, what I call pioneer species, the first ones that come in.
The screen itself.
It's over here.
Yeah.
And then you cut it. They're not even waiting now for that. They're cutting in 40-year intervals, which is down the scale of what they could grow. And they're not waiting for the 150 years or so that it takes to maximize the shade tolerant species. They're more valuable, I would add. If you've ever went and bought yellow birch or maple at a lumber mart, it costs a small fortune. There's a seed source from the original forest, and now the way they're clear cutting, there isn't. But if there is, you actually wind up with the seeding in under the pioneer forest. So about here, you start getting the original species come back. In about, yeah, and after somewhere up about here is where you wind up with actually good solid forests again with a lot of volume. I don't care about volume. It's more a matter of having mature trees. And these are the forests that have value. These are the forests where people are just harvesting the fiber down there, and they're not even waiting for the maximum. So
and then the sun-loving ones gradually peter out because
they're gone.
They're in the shade of the big older trees.
So I've been in my site for 50 years, and I walked in on a whole bunch of old fields that were growing up in spruce and fir and poplar and other things that grow in on the fields. And I knew I wasn't going to live for 150 years. So what I did was I made little holes, like pretending that one big tree fell down. I made little holes in the small forest and planted the yellow birch and the sugar maple and all those other trees. And now I can climb the trees that I planted. Some of the oaks, for example, are like this. And that's not a fish story. So, because I've been doing it for so long. And if you're not careful, the irony of it all is that the wildlife wipes you out. You have to protect the trees you plant because they're all programmed for these mature forests. And the rabbits and the porcupines and the deer, just even the muskrats ate my black ash when I planted it. But I want to point out that back in 300 years ago, this is the kind of forest they were harvesting. And if it was tall and straight, the pines were kept for masts for tall ships. And one of the things I've been saying, and some of the people that write me back afterwards, is we've shifted from masts for tall ships to moonscapes, which is really where it's been heading for quite a while. And many of these older species can live for a long time. The property that we gave to the New Brunswick Nature Trust, where I showed you the first picture, it had a tree that was 5 feet 5 inches in diameter at breast height. Pine. So they missed it because it was malformed. Thank goodness. So what happened starting, let's just say, a little over 300 years ago? was a bunch of land clearing. And fire became a prominent feature because they didn't have fire departments that were very effective. And when this sort of it happened on a grand scale all over Nova Scotia and elsewhere too, but I'm just talking mostly Nova Scotia now. And when the fires got away, often they burned to the sea. And it reminds me, there's this 1968 when you're driving from New Glasgow through to Antigonish. There's a plateau there just past Sutherland's River coming this way, where there was a Telford fire back in 68. And it was 6 miles long or wide at one point. And if the wind had blown from the west, it would have gone to Cancel Causeway. They couldn't control it. It was, and like some of the stuff this year, it's a time of year when it's very hard to stop a fire at this time of year. So I guess the point I have is that I've done a lot of work on crown land sites. And one of the first things we do is dig a soil pit, and a lot of other people do. And when they find a charcoal layer, they think that the whole area has been naturally had fire. And in reality, it's not true. It's the fact that they were susceptible to these burns. And they're more recent fires. They're higher up in the layer, and it's not what I might as well just say it right now. When you look into the old look at what happened many years ago, before let's say 1700, the main agents of change in the forests were not fire, but they were bug infestations, and there were hurricanes. And there's a lady by the name of Elena Ponomarenko, a person from Russia who's been working in Canada for quite a while, and she has dug on sites in western Nova Scotia where she said 500 years ago there were white pines. They had an infestation. There's a thing for petrified poop called frass that they call for insect. The ground is littered at a certain layer with frass. And so she knows it's an insect infestation. It was a pine tree, and there are caribou tracks. And she can figure that it was 500 years before. So we've got some good science here about what's happening. And fire was not prevalent until we came, really.
Humans.
Humans.
Or at least
I'm not saying you or me. I'm just saying, until humans came along here. Right? So we've gone from the kind of...
Could you clarify that? You mean Europeans or humans?
You're right. It's Europeans.
Okay.
First Nations folks barely. There's some evidence across North America that they burned on occasion in certain places, but it's not on scale. Thank you. Well, you can see from the size of the logs here.
Yeah.
This is a typical the sticks. And actually, it costs a fortune to run these machines, and it's not efficient at this size. And a lot of the stuff now they're harvesting every 40 years from the pioneer sites that started off from scratch. So the next picture I'm going to show you was actually taken by Port Hawkesbury Paper. I don't mind saying this because they were very proud and advertised that this is what they were doing on the Highlands. I don't want to digress totally on the Highlands, but I was in the media about it this past week. And this is up at Hunter Mountain, where you might know that there's a blockade right now.
Did mention about Hunter's Mountain, what's going on there currently, the protests.
Yeah.
And maybe you can elaborate for those who are unfamiliar about your take on what's going on there right now.
Well, my take was I don't want to stay away from the business of blockading roads. I wanted, as a biologist, to talk about what's been happening up in the mountain. And a gentleman who I really respect, Albert Marshall, had some words to say about what was going on in the Highlands. And that's what I wanted to talk about, because what moose need and what Port Hawkesbury Paper is producing up there is not good wildlife habitat for very few animals or plants. It's conifer plantations, and I showed a video that a friend of mine produced that proves the exact fact. It's just a sea of clear cuts separated by little ribbons and clumps, and it's not what moose need at all. I started working with moose in the 1960s here, as terms of what their winter browse was, and I continued to work as a biologist for a long time, and I almost know a little bit about what I'm talking about. So I backed up Albert.
You showed an aerial view of clear cutting, a video that was made. How impactful is it to see that aerial view of the of clear cutting. Whereas, for a lot of Nova Scotians, they just don't get to see it, and they don't get to see that view.
Well, I deliberately showed that because I think we can talk, but you don't see anything. And actually, what Albert Marshall was talking about was what I showed with that video. And it is not moose country. It's not rabbit country. It's just a whole bunch of softwood trees and cuts. And it's a wasteland for most wildlife species. And I just thought, a lot of people you talk, but they don't get it. But we're visual species. And I just did that because I wanted people to really understand the changes that are happening. First of all, the highlands are very harsh in the winter. A lot of deep snows, a lot of winds, and the trees that are native to the highlands were deep-rooted hardwood trees. And they had leaves, and they said they were poor quality, but the fact is they could stand up when the winds blew and the ice storms happened and that they were what could survive. So Port Hawkesbury paper is saying, oh, look what we're doing up on the highlands. Mm-hmm. We're putting in softwood trees. The hardwoods are deeper, they don't burn, they're more wind firm, and they resist drought because their root systems are deeper into the ground. I'll get more onto that.
Well, there's the monoculture aspect. And
that's right.
Too.
It takes a lot of work to keep this going, whereas nature does it the other way. And they wanted to use herbicides. So some of you that have lack of hair probably remember, like me, that after the spruce budworm battles with Elizabeth May, who I have a lot of respect for, I think as a politician, she's said it better than anybody else in a lot of issues. And we had a herbicide trial, and that was for here. They wanted to do this, and again, so the forest companies, lumber companies, and pulp companies want softwoods, and hardwoods are deeper, and that's what nature's trying to heal with, because the leaves of hardwood trees actually sweeten the soil, the ground, and the needles of softwood trees. First of all, they're resinous, so they burn. The pines have been called bombs because of what can happen. And I still have them, but you've got to be aware of what's happening. But not only that, but the needles are acidic. So you're actually making we have acid-based soils that are podzels, and there's all kinds of stuff to talk about there, but it's not healthy. So the whole business here is that not only do you shift to a softwood plantations that are more susceptible to a whole bunch of things, including droughts, fire, and wind. Then you're cutting off what nature's trying to do to heal, which is kind of sad. And just in terms of the acidity, there's too much on here. You could talk here for 20 minutes, but the fact is that Nova Scotia has some of the poorest soils. We are. For many years, we were on the tailpipe of North America in terms of acid rain. And it's not just acid rain, it's acid precipitation. There was solid matter coming down too. And the orange areas and the yellow areas are very poor soils where there's more leaching away nutrients in the upper layer than is coming in. And I just had to dig a whole bunch of stuff out of my driveway because over the years, if you're careful, you actually get soil accumulating. But in a lot of these sites, and of course, the first thing that happened was the salmon all disappeared from the rivers because the pHs went too low. So up where we are here in Cape Breton, it's a little bit better, but it's still a real concern. And this is something that has been steadfastly rooted. That the government will not admit that what they're cutting in. And I take no pleasure in saying this, but in Western Nova Scotia right now, most of the soils are so calcium poor, and there's been research done on this. A guy by the name of Roy Strang, an Australian. I used to work, one of my first real jobs, besides picking berries, was at Maritime Forest Research Center. And there were some interesting people working around the Maritimes, and I worked in Nova Scotia and the Encyclopedia. And he was studying some of the sites around Shelburne. And recommend that there shouldn't even be any forest, or you should just let the forest grow because the soil was so poor. There's been quite a reduction in sulfur deposition by acid rain in the last 30 years. It's been caught and it's been captured. But the problem is the nutrient, the there's enough acidity still coming that the soils haven't recovered. So it's a situation where they've been leached away and they're not rebounding. But the other thing I just want to point out is Nova Scotia maybe not very wide, but we didn't have highways, so this is how you move the logs. And there's a hangover effect from the gouging, and often in very small streams they'd dam it up, and then when there was a spring freshet they'd cut the dam and let everything come whooshing down, and they straighten rivers, which increase. If you take a string and go like this, you've got quite a bit, but if you take a string like this, it's a lot shorter, and that makes the river run faster. So there's all kinds of problems. I give talks on that stuff a lot. I work for inland fisheries for a few times. Interestingly enough, it got so bad that a fellow by the name Frederick Veith published a report in 1884 on the condition of rivers and the fisheries, because almost every river of any consequence in Nova Scotia had a series of dams like this one that still exists, and there were a lot of the waste was being dumped in the river. The fish would come up to here, salmon, trout, Gaspereau, shad, and be pitchforked and bailed out. And it was just, they talk about the good old days. I don't think they were all that good at times. And I won't go on with it, but what we're doing now, and this is my good friend Donna Crosland, we were actually asked by the government to add recommendations to a voluntary planning process where we all had a chance to say what we wanted to about forestry.
That was the day, wasn't it?
2009, 2010.
Oh, my point, that effort has disappeared too. Voluntary plan.
Yeah, they won't even show our report. And anyway, I won't get into that too far. But Donna and I wound up on a panel with John Porter, who was he was a woodlands manager of Bowater Mercy.
Now, you mentioned the Voluntary Planning Commission, which is something I do recall. And you talked about it almost as if the commission was kind of silenced and the report was basically hidden.
Yeah, we were asked as scientists to put science to three of us to form a scientific panel. We basically were asked, there was a demonstrated, in the voluntary planning process, there was a demonstrated public will for changing forestry. That really bothered the forest industry. There was one person on the panel who was forest industry. He didn't want any change. They basically, I guess the polite word would you say, they spent a lot of money to make the other two panelists, myself included, look like idiots, and sent that out to all the woodlot owners. And what happened was no change happened. The woodlot owners got scared and they didn't have any change. So I had been the chair of the model forest, and I knew a little bit of what I was talking about. And the person I worked with was a forest ecologist, and we had a better plan. But the plan was for ecological forestry, and the industry would have had to back off on just producing conifers. And in the short term, what they're doing, there isn't the soil productivity to sustain it. And we wanted to go back to growing hardwoods, working with nature instead of overpowering nature. It's an interesting phenomenon when you clear cut a piece of land like this, because all the frogs have laid their eggs in these skidder trucks. Mm-hmm. But the problem after you cut is that the water table goes up initially because the trees aren't taking up much and there's no shade. And then the whole thing goes down. So all these eggs, Donna was looking at the eggs at this time, and you wind up, I mean, it's just too, you don't need a PhD to figure out that this is too drastic a change for a forest. The sun beats down anyway, I think I'll get emotional and I shouldn't. The leftover thing here with the rivers is they became wide and shallow. They flush like toilets after the forest was removed, because the forest actually held the organics in place. And once that's done, in the summer rains, on a site like the one I just showed you here, everything just hits and runs. And the organic matter that's in the upper layer that used to feed the streams and keep the trout and all their other aquatic life growing is flushed down into the ocean. And it's missed. There's a fellow by the name of Terry Prosper at Buckingham who says, when a tree falls in the forest, there's an effect eventually in the ocean. And he is so right about that. And I should keep on going here. because the summer rains can do an awful mess here, and freshwater things as well. St. Mary's River. In the early 70s, I started taking temperatures there. It was up to 30 in the summer. Lethal is 30 degrees Celsius. Lethal is about 25. I mean, not everybody dies at a certain temperature, and there's some, but you see what happens here. This is the Stewiacke River. Think about how it used to be narrow and deep. Now it's wide and shallow, and the sun gets in, and then the sun heats the rocks, and the rocks are in the water, and the whole thing just it falls apart. I write articles about this, and it's too much to say in a way, but this is what you find when you go. It's interesting that we just spent a number of years on the St. John River with a boat, because the St. Mary's River is one of the two biggest rivers in Nova Scotia. I think it is the biggest river. And when we traveled on the river, we had to pick up, in the summertime, you had to carry the canoe between pools, because the riffles were like this. So, although the riffles are gone in this part of the Stewiacke. Anyway.
Why did you mention the St. John River though?
Because you have to go a long ways to be able to run a boat in a river.
Okay.
Around here. You've got the Bredora Lakes here. I'm not complaining about them. They're a wonderful place.
But in terms of rivers.
But in terms of rivers, well, it's not even fit for a canoe in the summer in a lot of our rivers, because it gets so low. And it's getting lower with all this cutting that's going on. This is a shot from into one of the pools. And the animals right here are salmon. They have saprolegnia, fungus growing on them, because they're in water that's too hot, trapped in a pool on the St. Mary's River. And these are white suckers who are much more tolerant of. The deal here is that as you warm water up, there's less oxygen in it. And you're basically suffocating cold water fish underwater by getting it too hot. So I want to talk a little bit about fire, because there's been a lot in the media that the industrial people who advertise across Canada and the ones in Forest, Nova Scotia have been saying a lot of things about what we should be doing, even in protected areas, thinning out forests and whatnot. The boreal forest in Western Canada, I've lived out there a number of times, and because I was an army brat, don't get too impressed. But you watch things, and then as the chair of the model forest, I did a lot of traveling out there, and I also fought a lot of fires in here. I was actually in one of these airplanes one time when the fire came, and it was a water bomb, and you get to go down on a lake, try to find a lake big enough that you can catch water and then go back up. And then when you dive into the fire and you drop your water and you hit a real heat updraft, talk about a roller coaster ride. It's kind of fun. Boreal forests were often, the major agent of change was fire. Lightning strikes and whatnot. It wasn't all people up there, because I lived in the Yukon, and I mean, once you get out of Whitehorse, there's not too much around in terms of people, which is nice, actually. A lot of wildlife. But I didn't miss. I like people. I wouldn't be here tonight, but the reality of it is that you can't blame people. Almost, there's the odd lightning fire here lately, but the forest has changed. It's now much more fire prone here. But the fact is, the boreal forests, that was the major agent of change. Whereas what I was telling you was that hurricanes and insects used to be the major factors. That's not true anymore because of what we've done. And basically, it started, like I said, with the land clearing. I've got notes here, but the fir and the spruce and the other conifers that the industry has planted for decades are fire bombs, and it's not natural. And Mr. Houston says that forests are like gardens. Well, you have to put a lot of work into a garden to have a good one, and they're not putting any work in. They're just letting things grow back, he doesn't know what he's talking about, and he doesn't listen to science. And I asked a senior, excuse my bluntness, but I asked a senior person who keeps calling me from the Conservative Party, does he have any credible scientific person to give him advice? And I didn't get an answer, which is really kind of upsetting for people like Gary and I.
Now, what are the main takeaways you're hoping that people would get from this presentation tonight?
They are that forests in Nova Scotia used to be quite fire resilient, and fires were not the main agent of change. In fact, the reality was with the proper, in a healthy forest in this part of the world, we're kind of sandwiched between the hardwood forests to the south and the boreal forest to the north. And as such, we actually, most of the drastic changes that happened between 800 and every 800 to 1,000 years. They were funded by insect infestations, and they were funded on the other side by hurricanes. And that's where, and you can analyze the blowdowns and everything else, so those were the main agents of change, and they didn't happen very often. Whereas now it's a whole different story.
Now, was part of the reason why you came here tonight because of the prevalence of wildfires that we've been seeing in Nova Scotia? Is that part of it?
Because our forests have been changed. Largely, they've been altered to be conifers, which have resinous needles. They're susceptible to drought because essentially they're shallow rooted, as we discussed, and they blow down easily because they're shallow rooted. So what the industry wants and what a healthy forest is two different things. Nature's trying to heal when they have, for example, hardwoods and leafy plants going in on an area that's been cut, and they don't want nature's process, but it's a healing process that prepares the soil to grow more trees. The resins just render what they're doing, and it takes herbicides, it takes fertilizer. There's all kinds of stuff that is wrong with what they're doing. It's not ecological forestry at all. I must point out, in all fairness, that in what fires that I've watched in Nova Scotia, two things. This is jack pine that I planted, and it actually, the cones open with heat, so it tends to come in. If there's any jack pine around, they survive a forest fire pretty well. And the other thing that happens is there's a lot of black spruce swamps, and the wetness of the swamp retards the fire. So then the black spruce, after the fire, go on a spree. They start growing up on the hillsides because all the other trees have been wiped out and probably cut and taken away. So it's interesting that those species have done quite well, and you often wind up with black spruce around after a fire.
Do you believe that the meaning or the true meaning of ecological forestry has been completely twisted and watered down?
Yeah, what's happening basically is William Leahy actually wanted to try to shift to that, but he gave them high production forestry and whatnot. But they're taking too much off the land. What's happening is by the time they put in the roads and put in the snake trails or the trails for the machinery and whatnot, they're taking about 50% of a given area. And that lets the sun in. That means the land dries out, and then when you get heavy summer rains, which you sure hadn't had this year, but normally you get heavy rains in the summer, and it washes all the organics out and into the stream and then down into the ocean, and you wind up with a wasteland. They're taking too much off a given area of land. They should maintain the shade on the property and take out enough that environment of shady, moist forest soils is maintained, and they're taking too much. Simple that. As far as animals are concerned, I don't have to say a whole lot about what happens to somebody who lives in a hole in the ground when there's a summer fire. I think you know what happens. And it's horrible. The biggest one I ever was involved in fighting was the Trafalgar Fire back in the 70s, 35,000 acres. And it went across a road that I was standing on like a jet plane. It sounded like a jet plane. It was a canopy thing. It just roared through. And a lot of animals that were mobile died. Out west, where the Wildlife Division is allowed to actually have real studies, they get some money to do something that doesn't happen in Nova Scotia. The bears actually are smart enough, and the fires occur often enough that a mother bear will take her cubs and run for the lake or the river.
Wow.
We have no evidence of that here. It's only recently that the fires have become more common, but even then, they're spotty. It's a long lake, and it was outside Halifax and this and that. But it may be that our wildlife will become acclimated and some will survive by doing that. But there's been no evidence yet. There's a lot of animals. Moose, for example, need 20 to 40 hectares and of habitat, depending on the quality of the habitat. And they like to be in water and eat. There's sulfates and other nutrients that are in pond aquatic plants that aren't in terrestrial plants. So if you're a female moose and you're going to get pregnant in the winter, you want to stock up with lots of nutrients. And if you're a male and you have to grow 50 pounds of horn to impress the ladies, you need an awful lot of calcium. So this becomes a really important thing. And they may be smart enough that they'll head for water, but we don't have very many moose left anyway on the mainland. But I do want to say that climate change is having an additional effect here. If you look at where moose have traditionally been, they're down as far as Massachusetts. And yet we have biologists that work for the Irvings that say that the moose are in trouble because, I just have to put this in, I'm sorry, but because they get infected with ticks and their moose in New Brunswick are in the southern edge of their range. Well, climate change is probably not helping moose because they've got a fur coat and our summers are very hot, but they do come to water. But most of the places where moose are in Nova Scotia are being taken over by wind turbines or gold mines, and the roads are put in.
Now, last year you did some presentations on wind farms. Soft topic.
Yeah.
And what is your reaction to the level of investment and support you're seeing from the federal and provincial governments into wind energy?
Well, I think this whole green energy, green hydrogen is you have to fix your own backyard before you start exporting stuff to other people. And we have a habit of taking money from corporations that want to make money and doing something on our land or our sea. And there's very little, other than a few people that get hired, there's very little benefit. And green hydrogen, it takes so much energy to get it over to Europe, for example. And I think we should be producing right now, for example, at the headquarters for Sobeys in New Glasgow, they've put solar over the parking lot. And I know my wife and I I was involved with wind generation. I've been worked for several companies and trying to figure out what happens with wildlife with them. And I believe in wind energy, but in Nova Scotia, we're going to where the moose are on the mainland. Higgins Mountain in Wentworth, Egg Mountain in Antigonish County, good examples. And they're putting in so much that the moose aren't going to be there anymore. I have lots of science about that, and well, to give it some. So I think we've got to be careful, and I think that our politicians, quite bluntly, are being led. They're not listening to environmental biologists that know a little bit about what's going on with the world around them, and they're just going ahead and looking at the money. And I guess I'm worried about the profits too, because I think a lot of it, people are coming in doing things, and then the money's going out. So I believe in wind power, and I believe in solar. I like the fact that at home I'm producing more power than I'm using, and I've got a electric hybrid car, so I can use it there too. And I like the fact that I'm basically just not causing a lot of trouble. I'm heating my home electrically partly, and I've got wood backup because it doesn't make sense to have all your apples in one barrel, so to speak. Something's going to go bad, and when the power goes out, I can still survive. So I believe that wind generation is a good thing up to a point, but I'm concerned about. I think solar, in the case of solar, only the electrons move, and that's when you look at what happens with the wind generators, they don't last a while. But a combination makes sense because there's times when there's no sun. And so I think we need it, but we're being pushed into it by foreign companies who are buying tugboats and all this other stuff, and we don't even for green energy. The government doesn't care about moose. It's most of these sites are whether it's a gold mine or wind generation, the moose are going to be the last moose in the province on the mainland. The problem with moose is not that they're at the southern edge of their range, or that the ticks actually show up when they're in poor shape. And I know a little. I started studying moose in the late 1960s, and it was what browse was being consumed in the wintertime. They wanted to know, and it was on mainland Nova Scotia. I worked all over the place. It was great. It was interesting. What's wrong is the fact that they're not getting enough nutrients. There's not. Moose need, and I'll just say this much: they need mature forest to travel through because they're big animals and they're obvious. We at the best we wind up with 20-meter wide riparian zones along waterways, and they can be seen, so they avoid them. They are essentially they need to travel through mature forest, and they need patches of younger forest with some hardwoods, because that's how they get. They need a diversity of plant materials, because they eat 40 to 60 pounds, depending on the season, of food a day. You think about how much you have to feed a cow. So they're not getting their nutrients. They get into poor shape, and it's because of what's happened to the land. I better not say too much more, but they're very demanding requirements. The nutrient requirements are very demanding, and I think they're a magnificent animal. The First Nations like them, and I think we should be managing for them. What the governments have done, not just the current one, but the moose were actually declared an endangered animal in 2003. The core habitat has been defined. I was on a mainland moose recovery team. There's been a new plan put out just recently. Not 1 centimeter or square inch of core habitat has been set aside. And when I write to the government, because there's a venue for doing that with a harvest plan reviewer thing, when they say, well, they're going to cut crown land, I say, this is core habitat for moose. It should be set aside. They don't even answer. So they're going with whatever else the development it wants to be. When we get back to fire again, I want to tell you that there's an awful lot of forest birds that need mature forest. And when a fire occurs, a few of them have a little bit of lung, but most of them just have air sacs, and they're even more susceptible to fire than we are. It's really bad for birds. And so they may be able to fly, but they're probably confused by the smoke, and some of them make it and some of them don't. I'd say they're even more vulnerable than animals, really, the mammals. Sorry. This is a fellow who did a genuine progress index on a variety of things, and I bet you know, yeah. And
Ron Coleman, right?
Yeah, Ron Coleman. The greedier we are, the faster we cut down our forests, overfish, kill other species, heat the planet, and poison the earth, water, and sky, the more the economy grows. We call that progress and development and a healthy economy, just in case you couldn't read it all. And I don't have to say too much more.
You mentioned there's trees that were felled by storms like Hurricane Dorian. The common belief is that these are really accelerating forest fires, but you don't seem to be of that belief at all.
What I've found with Fiona, for example, was that my own woodlot, I have 52 different kinds of trees. I've been planting them for 50 years. But a lot of the shallow rooted, even the poplars, the hardwood, blew down. And I operate 2 chainsaws, and I went out and cut some of it up. But what was happening was, if I didn't get it really quickly, it was already becoming fungused, and it was moldering into the forest floor. So one of my points tonight was that when the industry is saying that you've got to cut your land or it's in danger of being in fire, the wood that I had on my land was reduced by nature to a point where it wouldn't have burned much anyway. So I think we're taking what happens out west, where fire is a more serious issue and an agent of change, and we're producing it here, and it's not as bad as that people sounded. 2 years after Fiona, my wood wasn't even worth moving. I had to leave it. I left it in the forest because nature doesn't waste, and it'll grow a new crop of trees when it rots into the ground.
So you've done presentations on wind energy. Now you're talking about wildfires and forestry. So what are some of the other topics you're looking at maybe in the future or in the present?
Well, I've been doing a lot of talking for quite a while, Jim. You can tell by my age. I'm concerned about our waterways, and there's some good people rebuilding them, but they need to be. None of us live for the 300 years it takes to degrade a lot of these systems. I'm concerned about forests, and I'm also concerned about consumption. Really, we're in North America, we're consuming at a rate that's horrendous, and we can have a good life without all that. So we aren't traveling all that much, and when we do, it's not by plane or anything. And I think we've got to look at our lifestyles and say, if we don't want to have worse weather, it's time what we do right now isn't going to change much, but if enough of us change. So I'm quite concerned about getting back to healthy forests. It won't be the forest of 400 years ago, but we need to have a healthy environment around us that we can, that functions well. We need to have animals around and all kinds of things. And once you're in nature like that, I really think people feel more at home. If right now we're raising people that don't even, that's upper Canadian concrete and glass, and very few of them. We're in a rural area right now, and kids are kids, and they're out in the woods. But now that you're allowed to be, but I think we've got to be more responsible as individuals, and collectively we could slow this whole thing and be better. So there's lots to talk about still.
Thank you for watching Strait Talk. Please tune in again to find out what we will be talking about.